presence of the European Commission as well as from the ECDC, European Center for Disease Prevention and Control. So we will have two panels, two question and answer sessions. After the end of each panel's interventions, you will have the opportunity to ask questions to our experts. You can also ask questions using the chat that you can see in the at the bottom left, right-hand side of your screen. So I give the floor to my colleague Rosa D'Amato for this first panel, assessment of the digital COVID certificate 1 year later. Rosa D'Amato is a European MP, and she belongs to the group of the Green. Up to you, Rosa.
Grazie, Michelle. I will speak in Italian. I hope everything is okay. Grazie e benvenuti a questo seminario anche da parte mia.
Welcome to this seminar. Together with Michèle, we've been carrying out this debate, organizing this debate within our group and within the whole European Parliament. We want to understand how the European Digital COVID Certificate, called in Italy Green Pass, has been a tool used in the fight against the pandemic. And as Michèle said, given that they're considering the extension of the validity of this certificate, we need to determine whether or not it is worthwhile. We need to have a rich debate, an interesting debate. We need the participation of experts. We have medical experts and lawyers with us, and we needed to have an open and transparent discussion about this management of the pandemic. We also need to assess the way in which the media dealt with this issue and how the European institutions coped with this issue. So this is the first of a long series of webinars that we intend to organize. So the first panel will gather different people, different contributions. I would like to welcome Mr. Martin Zizi, molecular biophysician, ex-manager of the Institute of Molecular Biology and president of the Ethics Committee. He's going to tell us about the assessment of the public health measures that were put in place for the management of the pandemic. He's going to share with us a scientific view, and he's going to tell us about the results and the consequences that these European and national measures have entailed. Their goal was to secure the management of public health and to limit the impact of the pandemic. Thank you very much, Rosa. I'm going to share my screen now. Just give me a second.
Can everyone see my screen? Okay, perfect. So essentially, I thank Michèle Rivasi, I thank Rosa and all the attendees and the present and the people who try to organize this. And I have 12 slides, and it will take 10, 15 minutes to go through them. So I don't care about me, you know me, you read me here or there. What will I tell you in the next 15 minutes is the following. Essentially, in the whole crisis, we have to explain, and the government, we have to explain in terms of the crisis management, how 2 per 1,000 became 2 per 100. I'll explain. 2 per 1,000 is the actual mortality rate of this virus if we had done nothing. 2 per 100 2% is the result we had. So obviously there were glitches. And the glitches have reasons. You have the bad statistics to start with, a crisis management done with incomplete metrics. We will come back to that. A near stop of the first medical line of care. We didn't address the clinical speed of the disease. I want to remind everyone that SARS means severe, acute, respiratory syndrome. Severe, well, it's dangerous. Acute means it's pretty damn fast. And respiratory, we should focus on the lung in start, because then it's too late. Then zero COVID as a policy, as a healthcare policy, is impossible for many reasons, but mostly because SARS and all its cousin, all the family of the virus, is a zoonosis. That, and I will come back to that. That means that first, eradication is impossible. So we can dream as humans to do things, but nature has a way. We cannot violate physics. We cannot go faster than the speed of light. We cannot eradicate a zoonosis. This should be not known. And when you have a zoonosis, a vaccine-only approach is very, very impossible, because you have to start to vaccinate the cat, the cows, the kangaroo, and the pangolin also, which is quite a fact. So now, the bad statistics. You will get access to this media. We don't need to read everything here, but I want to show you two things that happened. Early on in the crisis, and it was the same in all European countries, you had the government the first month or two trying to do something, and there is a panic, the fog of war also, and panels are set in place. But very quickly, in all the countries, those panels are hijacked. And you have on the left an extract from a mail we exchanged with scientists in Europe by a very known and high-level UK panel member for the crisis, who clearly said that the statistics were overblown by decision, that a few of the experts took control of everything, and that after a while, most of the independent experts left disgusted because the government didn't want to listen to a plurality of advice.
Donc parce que le gouvernement ne voulait pas écouter une pluralité d'avis.
A narrative that's created. On the right side of the screen, there is a paper I want every one of you to read. It's by Harry
Droit. Donc, une analyse d'un expert, donc un expert canadien qui était membre d'un panel au Canada, a changé d'avis et il a
the lockdown groupthink. And in the groupthink, he gives, that's important for the political establishment in Brussels, he gave the source of the political text that led to decision. And it is fascinating to read that there, the advisor, Imperial College for the UK and US, literally said, this is going to kill a lot of people, mostly poor, but, well, we have no choice. So no one can say such a decision was done by, we didn't know. All the political tracing exists. So now we go to the 2 per 1,000 versus the 2 per 100, and then we go in detail. I want to explain to every attendees a difference in terms of two metrics that can be used by epidemiologists to assess a danger. First, there is the danger of the germ itself. We call that the infection fatality rate. That means that it's the death rate, the fatality cases, based on are you sick, are you not sick, but carrying the virus or the germ. So it's really the chance of a fatal outcome if you have the bacteria or the virus in your blood. We call that infection fatality rate. And the other case, the other metrics is the CFR, which is the case fatality rate, which is actually the fatality rate of the management. So on one side, is the virus dangerous? On the other side, the CFR, do I perform well? It turns out that in the media and throughout the crisis, the management of the crisis always use the CFR, which reflect, do I manage well? And we ended sometime in a stupid situation where, the number got wrong, the number of the mismanagement. So let's do more management instead of looking at the IFR, which is the stuff dangerous? So is there a danger versus how do I manage and navigate the danger? But if we compare, and this is important, those IFR and CFR for both SARS-2 and the flu, the pandemic flu, the data exists, they're the same. This might sound as news to a lot of people, but if you look at the mortality in terms of IFR of SARS-2 is 2 per thousand. If you look, that's what the slides with the reference are important for everyone to see. If you look at the mortality of the flu, it's also the real flu diagnosed with PCR, it's between 1, 3, and 5%. So, no, the CFR, but the IFR is also around 0.2. So essentially, both the IFR and the CFR of SARS and the flu are within the same range. And if we look at the mortality rate of alpha, which is the son of SARS, it starts to be the same, the CFR, so the 2% is SARS CFR. If we go to alpha, it's 1.9%. But if we go to delta, that's very interesting. Delta is only 5 per thousand. It's already 4 times less. Reading the news, no one would think that delta is not that little, because when you have 5 per thousand, well, as CFR, you fall very close to a seasonal flu now. And then if you look at Omicron, that was the good news, because its CFR so the mortality measured as CFR is below 1 per 10,000. Well, which is lower than the flu. So this is the basic statistics, but the crisis management was done with incomplete metrics. I'm not accusing people of anything. I say we have 2 metrics, and for reason that I'm not able to explain, we have only used half of it, which reflected how bad or good we manage the crisis. Now, this IFR vary with age, and this is a very important point. The WHO, after the American epidemiologist Ioannidis published the first study, the Santa Clara study, in April, May, early in the crisis of 2020, he found that the IFR, the infection fatality rate of the disease, was 2 per thousand. So he was surprised himself. He said, hey, guys, this is not that difficult to manage. But he was shut off the news. And then everyone did that, a lot of groups, 60 different countries on the planet, different people, different population, different group. They all got the same result. On average, without splitting by age, the IFR was always between 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Okay. And this was confirmed after 60 paper by the WHO, which published the big image on the upper left. When you see different studies mentioning the IFR, the infection fatality rate per age, you have to enlarge your screen, but you will see that below 60, it's very, very low. But it starts to pick up. At 60, start to be around the per thousand. 65, we enter the person zone. When you're 70, you're above 2%. And if you have 85 years of age, it can be 4 to 6%. So this SARS is very dangerous as you age, like a lot of those respiratory viruses. And then there is another data analyzing all the results of the crisis now from Denmark. There was a recent paper. The group from Eric Strupp controlled the fatality rate, the true fatality rate, which is the infection fatality rate for each wave, first, second, third, fourth. He didn't do the fifth because we don't care about wave anymore. We know that it's getting now in the endemic zone. But he looked at the age and the comorbidity status, which is important. And what he found is really interesting because, and they have great data in the paper, very well done, very careful, is the IFR without comorbidity. If you're below 60 years of age, it's zero. You heard me well. It's in the 1 per 100,000, 1 per 100,000. Then it becomes a bit higher when you get close to 60. But if you have a comorbidity now, so that was 60, no comorbidity, think that it's zero, you're close to. If you have above 60 years of age and or comorbidities, you start to become like the flu again, 3 per thousand. And it can go higher, but the highest level will never be as high as we saw during the crisis. And essentially, it was never higher than 2.7%. So these are different statistics that those we have been hearing during the year, and these are large-scale studies. The study of Denmark is done on an impressive amount of people. What if you look now with a more granulation? I said that we didn't use the right metrics. Now we have the right metrics. we seem to see that age is a very critical factor, because above 60, there is a turning point in terms of your personal risk. And then what about the morbidity? We know that without comorbidity, it's pretty easy to survive or not to be even aggressed by the virus. And there is a data point that I want to add to the group, is a teaching comparison between Cameroon and USA. Cameroon is, and a lot of African countries like that, they have no death. Everyone predicted a catastrophe. For Africa, it turns out that the catastrophe didn't happen there. But when you look at their population structure explanation, it's very, very interesting. I take Cameroon, but you can do the same with other countries that have no mass vaccination program, because the one who mass vaccinate, like Europe, end up on the same spectrum as the European countries. They have a population of 27 million inhabitants in Cameroon, and they have 97% of their population is below 60 years. It's incredible. They have 4% of vaccination coverage, and they only lost 1,900 people on 27 million for 2 years, which is a rate of 71 deaths per million. Trivial. It's below the daily fatality rate. If you look at the USA, the US, alternatively, they have a population of 230 million. Their population structure, they don't have a lot of young. If you compare, only 18% are below 25 years, compared to 60% below the age of 25 for Cameroon. They have 66% full vax. I didn't count for the sake of good comparison, I didn't count the third vaccination, the fourth, and etc. with the booster, because Cameroon didn't have them. And the total fatalities are nearly 1 million, which is 3,000 deaths per million, which is 40 times more than Cameroon for a full, a 2/3 of the population coverage. This shows beyond reasonable doubt that comorbidity are the main driver of fatalities. And the vaccine is not relevant. It might be not politically to say, but it's not that relevant in terms of impact, because if you're less than 60 and you have no comorbidity, you have no risk. And if you compare the USA for Cameroon, well, the situation is mostly depending on what we say in French, the terrain, the background. The structure of the US population of comorbidity, well, they have overweight people, they have a lot of diabetes. In Africa, the problem is not being overfed. So we have a difference there in the population structure that explains the sensitivity difference in terms of virus. So it means the message of focus on fast care delivery to elderly and comorbids may have brought CFR to IFR level. And this is the point I want to explain to the crowd. CFR is the case management fatality rate. It means, how do I do? Do I perform well? IFR is the infection fatality rate, is the bug dangerous. If my performance, my management was perfect, both metrics will fuse nearly, and CFR will become IFR. So one of the explanations for what 2 per thousand became 2%, it's because we didn't focus enough on the elderly and the comorbidity. Now, when you have to manage a crisis, it's like driving a car. You need to have a dashboard with speedometer, with tachymeter, with the distance, etc. And you need tests in terms of public health. And sadly, one of the conclusions of 2 years is that the reliance of PCR test, which is highly, highly sensitive, led the decision maker to a blind zone, because they made them do an informed decision. Why? We all know, the molecular biologists in the group and over the planet, that PCR is a confirmation tool. It's not reliable for mass screening because it's too damn sensitive. You can measure a molecule. PCR cannot be used as... Yes?
Sorry.
Hello?
Can you quickly, please, because we don't have time, if you conclude...
I will speed up because I have only 10. Don't worry. So PCR cannot be seen as an infection or as contagion. The main explanation is here. You see that PCR on the lower part of the screen is positive for too long. It's positive before, it's positive during, it's positive after. This led to a real problem in terms of the assessment, and you can read the slides later yourself. Then what you do, because you need to advise the government, with the group COVID rational in Belgium, we had a replacement strategy by replacing PCR with antigen testing, and the flow chart is given on the right, and it includes PCR, but essentially it will give the politician and the decision maker the tool, and the public health authority the tool to do it, while cutting down on the PCR number, which are not valid and not safe. It was, by the way, approved, but never shared with anyone. The main message is that healthcare is a personal service delivery model, because we use remote medicine. We try to do telehealth. But the problem is that in telehealth, there is a lot that we cannot do. We have technical limitation. You cannot look in the ear. You cannot listen well to the lung of the patient. So all of those remote medicine cannot take care and deliver healthcare fast enough. And essentially, the first line could have done a lot to treat situation. I'm not going into therapies here that are bizarre. I say when someone starts to have obstruction, maybe the person needs oxygen. When someone gets a bacterial serum infection, which is very frequent in this disease, maybe someone needs antibiotics. And it turns out that most people went between the house where they're safely sheltered to the ICU without being managed by medical practitioner. And essentially the strategy of flattening the curve without healthcare delivering corresponded to spreading the death as a function of time, which is probably not the best outcome. Then I want to do a quick message about Omicron, because Omicron is the endemic form of the virus, which is normal. It's a normal virus now. And people start to doubt that and say, well, it's dispersed so fast that it's so dangerous. No, the fast dispersion is an excellent good news, because a virus in respiratory virus has to choose either disperse or kill. And there is this image on the left, which is a cartoon. If a virus kills you in one day, well, the transmission chain stops with you, because you don't breathe out viral particle anymore. You know, corpses do not cough, so it stops there. Whereas if the virus gives you 5, 10, 20 days, well, then you can have a wider transmission network and in the end propagate faster. And the fact that the virus, like SARS Omicron version, took over the planet in a few weeks, the planet, means that it's very...
Martin, sorry, Mr.
Okay, then I can skip the slide.
Zizi, sorry.
I want to say that the focus... I have a last slide here.
You can continue your explanation, answer to the question if you want. Please, conclude.
I just have one last slide here. That the focus of zero COVID, I said, is a public health impossibility, because the SARS family is known as a zoonosis. But zoonosis is not meaning that the virus has animal reservoir. It means also that the virus has also other species it might use as host. And in the end, you have a molecular viral ping-pong game between human, the cat, the dog, the deer, the minks, even the hippopotamus, which make then eradication and vaccine only difficult. And it is the lower right panel in my slide. It's public knowledge. How to successfully eradicate a virus? Well, you need to have a very strong vaccine, no intermediate hope, no infection, which in each case was not the case for us. So, and then I must keep this if we don't have the time, because I think now that the crisis for the virus is over, we start to see more and more problem with the vaccine. And it's too long to explain, but essentially a vaccine has a posology and a biodistribution. When a normal vaccine is injected, when you use mRNA, well, you don't control the quantity produced, which can lead to many different level effects, and you cannot control technically the location of the produced protein that has to go from the muscle cell to the blood, and the one that stays behind in the muscle might trigger the immune system in what we call, in its own concept, modified self, which means that the immune system might attack spike, not for spike, but also for the muscle cell. Think about myocarditis. Uterus is a muscle. Around the blood vessel, we have muscle. So you start to see why some of the autoimmune side effects are possible. And so I think if we look also deeper in the vaccine data these days, and this is something that starts to become apparent. Post-injection, you start to see in some patients, not most, but in some patients, 2 to 3%, an immunosuppression that's linked to innate immunity, which is not the immune reaction against a specific germ or not. It's just like the tuning of the system. And then you can get, because the system is tuned down, opportunistic infection like in HIV patients from past, and it's on the slide. So I thank you. I'm sorry that I had to go a bit too fast, but I think the key information is on the slide. Me, I'm not relevant. And I think as a person that we made the mistake of focusing on logistics. Instead of focusing on the healthcare delivery and on the patient, we focus on the logistic, protecting the hospital, delivering vaccine, everyone there, and controlling dispersion, which is impossible with the zoonosis. And now we are here 2 years later, trying to figure out what to do with the QR code and the COVID safe pass, where actually it was a tool that was not effective and was counterproductive. And I let all the other speakers to explain that in detail. And as if we were to go there with adding medical data to an identity, electronic identity system, I feel, based on what we see, that the biomedical data should be very GDPR protected.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zizi. I leave the floor to Madame Amato to continue with the next speaker.
Sì, grazie dottor Zizi. Io vi faccio un appello a tutti gli oratori. So che è un'occasione ghiotta per esprimere.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zizi. Now I would like to ask all speakers to stick to the time. You have to 10 minutes, please. Now, I would like to hand over to Mr. Biondi, tenured research fellow within CNRS France. He's going to tell us about pandemic management. You have the floor.
Sharing my slides. We share my screen. Just a minute. So, okay, I'll try to be brief. I wish, first of all, thank you, Madame D'Amato and Madame Rivasi, for your kind invitation and this occasion to share my research on this matter. I will go directly straight to the point. We are here to discuss this extension of the EU digital COVID certificate, which is worth to remember that has been used as an instrument to enforce discriminatory measure against the unvaccinated in many cases in many member states. So it was intended by the EU to facilitate and assure the movement, cross movement in Europe, cross-border movements, but has ended up to be used in a very different way. And the policy, which is recommended by the Council recommendation, is very clear. So the member state, to get the green light on the EU traffic light map, required to have a low number of cases, and that number of cases weighted by the vaccination uptake, which is supposed to reduce transmission by 1/2. And so the EU pandemic management is very clear, and is based on case counting, mass testing, and vaccination uptake. So the first issue is that the threshold which are fixed by the European Commission in this proposal is very low. The number of cases over 2 weeks are to be less than 0.08% of the population. In the case of full vaccination, even lower when the vaccination uptake low down. This threshold has never been reached since the beginning of the pandemic, mid-2002, virtually never, you can see in this slide. And even since the introduction of the green light, only Mayotte has been green occasionally. So essentially, we are talking about a zero COVID strategy, like China and a few other countries are trying to enforce. But the problem I will try to address here, complement what Professor Zizi has done. So he addressed the problem with numbers from a clinical and epidemiological viewpoint. I will stick with the managerial problem. We are trying to manage the pandemic by numbers, and pandemic management by numbers can be very misleading. The numbers, of course, carry an aura of objectivity of being scientific, and we have been counting infections, so cases, hospitalization, and death as a fact, as if we pretend to control the pandemic diffusion in real time. This may be reassuring for us, but this is actually not the case. The problem with the reported number we have been using and discussing is that they don't picture the real evolution in a trustworthy manner. So essentially, we have numbers which has a blurred connection with the underlying phenomenon. So this wish to control the pandemic diffusion in real time and even to forecast its behavior is misleading. The first problem, which has already been addressed by Martin, is that no such a thing as a case exists. So essentially, the case depends on the testing. And even if you test every day the whole population, the problem will not be solved. So when someone tests positive, it can be just a false positive, so the test went wrong, or it can be a test which doesn't match, which presents lively presence of the virus in its host, or it can be an healthy carrier, so someone which is carrying the virus but is healthy, or it can be someone who will never develop a serious illness by carrying the virus. So you have essentially 6 possibilities when you test positive, and just the 6th one will imply having a serious condition which require medical attention. And the same problem with the death toll. So we have the problem with the testing, which is the basic indicator for measuring the death by the pandemics. And you add the problem with causation. So you can die with the COVID or just due to the COVID. So in the first case, for instance, if I take an extreme example, you have a car accident and having tested positive by the COVID, and you'll be counted in some circumstances as died with COVID. And this is very different from dying by the COVID, of course. Similar problem with saturation of hospital, which has scarcely occurred actually in any member states. But the problem is that you can test positive in hospital, in nosocomial infection, or you can just be tested before admission and be admitted in hospital for other reasons. And of course, we don't control the full process through hospitalization, which would be required to properly counting this hospitalization and hospital admission. So the main message for this, my first part, is that we cannot conflate a positive test as an evidence of sickness. So this would be misguiding. And all the policies which are driven by numbers based on this positive test would be misguided. So essentially, we have been testing disparate people who carried a viral fragment in their nose, but this doesn't mean much for their underlying medical status. It doesn't explain the reasons for hospitalization and death. So imagine, for instance, if we test for cold and flu, all the people admitted to hospitals. Every season, you will get 1 million of people being hospitalized with cold and flu, but it will not explain anything about what we really need for public health purposes. So this paved the way to a quite methodological or managerial critique of the pandemic management. So driven by this naive belief that we can picture the whole phenomenon, the whole pandemic diffusion, and even forecast its behavior, we have been advocating very extreme measures, and we are also advocating for mass testing and mass vaccination. Essentially, a different approach exists. So we can rely on techniques which existed before the recent technology, which has enabled this kind of mass tracking, and we can sample the population. So if we use the statistical techniques, we can have a representative sample of the population, and we can discriminate between vulnerable and non-vulnerable people. It was the same point Professor Zizi was just mentioning before. And by discriminating vulnerable people, we can have a more targeted approach, which doesn't require this mass approach. So on the one hand, you will have an approach which has been the received approach and dominant approach until today, where you require mass testing and mass vaccination, and you end up having quite an authoritarian approach to public health, involving discriminatory policy in many cases. Or you can have more focused protection approach, which target vulnerable people and can be respectful on informed consent and fundamental rights. So the problem is, and I think Martin has already stressed this, that we assumed the worst case scenario at the beginning of the pandemic. So we assumed that more than 3% of the people will die, and that immunity prior and after infection will not occur. And virtually all the population were at zero risk of hospitalization and death. But this has never been the case. Since late springtime, 2020, we know by proper statistical information and medical information that the vast majority of cases were non-existent, mild, or asymptomatic. And positive testing has always been disconnected from actual medical condition, and is even increasingly so with the Delta and the Omicron variants. If you look at mortality, sound mortality studies, you can see that excess mortalities were quite modest and concentrated on the old and fragile people in the society. And most of the death come from people which are already beyond median and mean age at the time of death, and were affected by comorbidities, and were living in a large part in healthcare facilities with very spare contact with the community life and very limited life expectancy. So what are those implications? So what they have been doing is trying a very extreme new approach to pandemic management, and it was already tried with another pandemic 10 years ago, the so-called swine flu. And the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe was very, very critical of that approach at that time. And we should remember that election, which has been forgotten. And we go even further this time for a pandemic, which perhaps we know now for sure that it was not that threatening. So we can understand the panic at the very beginning, but after 2 years, we can do something different now. And I want to stress also that the way we have managed the pandemic has been extremely costly. Imagine mass testing. So, for instance, UK has been testing its population 5 times. And if you remember at the beginning, the European Commission asked the member state to ask at least 1/3 of the population every year to get the green light. Or now, if UK will have tested only hospital admission, so people which actually ask for medical attention due to the COVID, they will only test 6 million people through the entire pandemics by the end of 2021. For the vaccination doses, the same could be said, because the European Union has been trying to vaccinate everyone essentially. And if they have vaccinated only the older people in the population, they will done less than 100 million doses. So just the 2 key messages at the end, and I will conclude. So please remember the numbers are not fact. They depend on the way the numbers are gathered and the accounting systems behind them. So we cannot pretend by those numbers to master the phenomenon as they are. They are just statistical techniques that can help us understand the emerging pattern and implied risk. And by doing so, we can clearly identify vulnerable people. And we also know that vaccination don't prevent infection and transmission. So we can say safely that, that vaccination for all and mass testing is no longer required, and violation of fundamental rights are no longer justified by necessity and proportionality, which are the main criteria behind them from the legal viewpoint. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Grazie Mr. Biondi, grazie per essere stato nei tempi. Io passo direttamente la parola al prossimo
Mr.
speaker.
Biondi. I would like to hand over immediately to
Stadler,
the
direttore generale
next
per giustizia
speaker.
e consumatori della Commissione europea.
Mr. Jan Rodistadler,
Dr.
Director
Rodistadler,
General for Justice
floor
and
is yours.
Consumers from the European Commission. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ms. D'Amato. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay. I hope you can see my screen. Can you just briefly
Indeed, we can. You can
Perfect.
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Indeed. So now going back also on the subject of today's workshop, the EU Digital COVID Certificate, I'll give a very brief, trying to stick to the timeline given, an overview of the objectives and of the implementation of the EU Digital COVID Certificate up to now. And maybe a bit anticipating the discussion in the second panel, I'll touch very briefly on the reasons why the Commission decided to put forward a proposal to extend the regulation by another 12 months, but there will be a dedicated second panel on this. Very briefly, obviously, we are all very familiar with the subject. What the regulation, so the EU law instrument is, it establishes a legal framework for the issuance, for the verification, and for the acceptance of 3 types of certificates, which are vaccination, test, and recovery certificates. So we have these 3 types. And the objective of the regulation itself is to use that tool to facilitate free movement in the EU during the COVID-19 pandemic. I put down here some of the governing principles of the system that are of particular importance to us. The first I've mentioned, it's a tool that is free of charge. So a citizen does not need to pay to obtain the certificate. It's also available in a paper and in a digital form. So also people that do not have a smartphone can benefit from it. When the system was set up, great attention was paid to the issues of data protection and privacy, meaning that, for example, there's no central database or anything storing the information. The information is only encoded in the certificate. You have it in of course, human readable form and then in the QR code, but all the verification, everything happens offline. No personal data is exchanged between the member states when a certificate is used. It is secured by using a so-called public key infrastructure. What was also important to us and what turned out to be very helpful in our approach towards other interesting countries outside of the EU is that the system itself is open source. So people can go online, can look at the source code of the software that's used, and interesting countries that want to join the system can use that. And so we have this transparency here. We have a flexibility in the system that I touch upon in a bit, and also actionable. So as I think many of us are familiar with, the data is encoded. So when it's scanned, I don't need to read it. I don't need to look at all the data. I get a green check mark. I get a red X or something. So you have this actionable element in the system. A bit of the background, explaining a bit why this was established. If we look back at the end of 2020, early 2021, we might still remember. I mean, we had a great variety of different test certificates that were required, and if you got a test certificate from one country, it wasn't accepted in another country because of language differences and so on. So there was a clear desire to have something that if I get tested, if I get vaccinated, if I recover in one member state, I can show it anywhere else and it's accepted. I don't have to have a translation or whatever. So that was this clear desire at the political level. It was also quite ambitious because the aim was to have the system up and running in time for the 2021 summer season, and indeed we also needed a system that takes into account the great flexibility among the healthcare system of member states. We have some member states that don't have central vaccination registries, where some do, so that you have this divergence between the member states, and we needed a system that is flexible enough to take these differences into account. We have it, and I have it here on the slide. It was adopted by the European Parliament and by the Council in June last year, and was is in force for 12 months, so until June 2022. And I'll come in a bit to the extension. Some, I think, very, very important points also for today's discussion. The first one is that the regulation does not require member states to have travel restrictions in place. That's completely, it's a decision for the member states. The COVID certificate regulation does not require member states to ask for the certificate. It just establishes the framework to have the system in place. And we have it now. I mean, luckily, we are in a situation now where many member states do not require citizens to have the COVID certificate when they travel, which is good, which is a situation where we all want to go back to. What it does, the regulation, is that we have a certificate that must be accepted when member states lift restrictions. So even if I was vaccinated, even if I was tested in another member state, if I travel somewhere, if I meet the requirements, my certificate must be accepted. That's the big difference, of course, to the situation before. What's also important is, of course, the regulation does not establish an obligation to be vaccinated to travel. Absolutely not at all. That's clearly spelled out in the regulation. And it's to further underline this point that we have 3 types of certificates, not just vaccination certificates, but also for tests, also recovery. So of course, even if a person for whatever reason cannot be vaccinated, doesn't want to be vaccinated, you have the option of a test certificate, you have a recovery certificate. And then a last very important point is that the regulation and what we talk about at the EU level and what we talk about when it comes to the extension, it does not concern the domestic use of the certificate as we have it in some member states. The Green Pass, I think, was mentioned, is the Italian domestic use of the certificate. This is because this is a healthcare decision, a healthcare policy, which is something that the member states are doing, not the EU level. So that's a decision for the member states. It's their decision, and they have to have the national legal basis to do that. Some member states decided not to go this way. Some did, and that's a national decision that's not required by the regulation. What we talk about when we look at the implementation, we have recently made a count. We have by now issued, so the member states have issued more than 1.7 billion certificates. Obviously, there are more than the inhabitants that we have in the EU, simply because some people got multiple doses of a certificate, some people made multiple tests. So we have a multitude of certificates. The system is also flexible to adapt to new developments. 2 important ones I've put in the slides. Recently, for example, I mean, we have made progress in the reliability of rapid antigen tests. So it's now also possible to issue recovery certificates based on positive rapid antigen tests, not just on PCR tests, as it was originally the case. We have also, because of the openness that I mentioned at the beginning, we have been able to connect other interested third countries, non-EU countries, to the COVID certificate system. Obviously, we offer this. We offer the open source software, and 37 third countries have already taken up this offer. We have with the UK, we have a bunch of European countries, but we have countries all over the world that have been connected. Most importantly, of course, and this is also plays into why we decided to extend the certificate, or why we proposed to extend it, is that we avoid having 27 different national solutions that don't talk to each other, that don't work with each other, but you have one single system. touching very briefly on why the Commission has put forward a proposal to the European Parliament and to the Council to extend the regulation by 12 months. Why? I mean, the explanation is quite simple. We don't know what will happen in the second half of 2022, in the first half of 2023. We don't know yet that we are completely out of the woods yet. So the extension makes sure that we can use the system in case we need it. Again, we don't have to use it. Member states don't have to require travel restrictions, but if they do, we want the tool to be in place.
Just a second, please.
Yes, one last sentence, but the extension does not mean that it needs to be used at domestic level. That's again a national decision, and so the Commission's clear goal is to go back to a completely unrestricted free movement at a period where we don't need a certificate, we don't need a passenger locator form. That is, of course, our ultimate goal, which is also why we proposed a time-limited extension. Thank you.
Ok, grazie anche alla Commissione per essere stata con noi.
Thank you very much to the European Commission. Thank you very much for your contribution. Now I would like to hand over to our last speaker, Dr. Alberto Donzelli, specialist in hygiene and preventive medicine from the University of Milan, Italy, and former senior manager in public health and member of the Superior Health Council. You have the floor.
Conflict of interest. Potete disattivare la mia traduzione in simultanea. Parlo in inglese se riesco a far progredire le slide. From February, there was a binding acceptance of 9 months for vaccination certificates for travel within the European Union. Are these rules able to prevent or drastically reduce a SARS-CoV-2 infection and transmission to others? The Italian law obliges healthcare and school workers, other professional categories, and over 15s to receive vaccines and boosters for the prevention of SARS-CoV-2 infection. Unfortunately, there is strong scientific evidence that this prevention is impossible with current vaccines. Indeed, in the medium term, such vaccinations not only lose any protective effect, but involve even greater infection risks. Time allows me only to focus on this problem, not on some useful alternatives. This is an important article in BMJ from the Institute, the Superior Institute of Health of Italy, and shows that with the follow-up ending in November of the past year with Delta variant, that the elderly had at 8-9 months a vaccine effectiveness less than the one of people not vaccinated. This is true also for middle-aged and for people more needing to be protected, people at high risk, immunocompromised, with comorbidities on residence in long-term facilities. The vaccine effectiveness was significantly under the level of unvaccinated people. This is overlay clear in the serial publications of weeks in the UK Health Security Agency reports. This is the week 36, in which for the first time the age classes 40 to 79 had rates of COVID-19 cases among persons vaccinated per 100,000 greater than rates among not vaccinated. But comparing the entire column, the vaccinated rates in week 36 remained lower, but in week 33, there was a turning point. Summing all of the age columns, the cases among vaccinated with 2 doses exceed those of the not vaccinated by 2.5%. The trend continues consistently in the subsequent weeks, and in the second week in the present year, the excess of total cases in the vaccinated column started from week 43 of the past year, exploded in a few months, and even doubled. But in the third week of this year, the UK Security Agency decided to compare only with the unvaccinated only with subjects with 3 doses or more. Despite this change, the vaccinated persons continue to have more infections than unvaccinated. And this trend continued till week 13, in which the cases in vaccinated with 3 doses were 3 times and 15% more than the cases in unvaccinated. It is extremely clear that vaccinated people are more likely to become infected in the medium term. Does the 4th dose restore protection? This is the answer. Very large study in Israel shows that in only 8 weeks, less than 2 months, the protection has fallen to the level of the third dose. In the game of the goose, this is the return to the first square. This is the situation in Denmark, where only 4 months after the second dose with Omicron, the protection is negative, and the double doses vaccinated have a level of infections 76% more than unvaccinated people, and its trend is to get worse. Accordingly, if we vaccinated children, they will infect their grandparents after a few months, or should be boosted for the life. Moreover, it is logical to demand antigenic test every 2 days to guarantee comparable protection as a vaccination. No, it is not logic. Even a weekly test will be better than a 0 guarantee. Here we can see from the Qatar data that the asymptomatic infection is the first to deteriorate, and among the vaccinated, the first increase is in asymptomatic infections, 50% over the level of infectiousness of unvaccinated. And for children, the situation is even worse. Here is the state of New York. You can see that only 45 days after the second dose of vaccine, after in the Omicron era, there is a 41% of efficacy, effectiveness, less than the one of the unvaccinated. In Italy, the situation is the same, and it's emerging from the data.
Si può andare a conclusione?
Sì, io concludo. From the data of the Institute of Health. Here is the March 16 week. Apparently, the vaccinated are better than unvaccinated, but a week later, the unvaccinated were better, and the vaccinated had a 10% more infections. In the week later, 19% more infection. In the week later, 21.5% more infections. And in the week, the past week, 23% more infection. How long is the Green Pass issued to children valid? Once they receive the second dose, they will get a 9-month certificate, just like adults, a license to infect. And this is my last slide. If the Europe certificate is aimed to protect the European community from the infection, it does not have the claimed scientific support and may even be hazardous in the medium term for public health. Therefore, it could be safely dismissed with several effective alternatives.
Grazie, dottor Donzelli. Allora, facciamo così, se ci sono domande soprattutto da giornalisti o da altri...
If there are questions, well, I'm trying to synthesize the questions I read in the chat. I'll give the floor to Michèle and then to somebody else who'd like to ask a question, and then I will have a question. Michèle?
Merci de ces interventions. Et je voudrais...
Thank you very much for these presentations. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Stadler from the Commission. You want to renew this COVID certificate, but several presentations have shown that once vaccinated, you spread the virus and you become more susceptible to infections. Why hasn't the Commission carried out any impact assessment? At the beginning, there was no time for that, but 2 years later, how come then that 2 years later, the Commission still hasn't made any impact assessment study and presented it? First question. The second question, you haven't explained why this European digital COVID certificate has been set up. It's been put in place for public health reasons. It was thought that it was going to decrease the spread of the virus. All the studies that we've just heard about clearly show that it is not the case. So you are proceeding as if you wanted to favor vaccination by the member states. So you're deviating from your original objective, which was to secure health security. It's been shown that it's not the case. It has not worked, but you've used it to favor vaccination. And you said it was wonderful. It was a wonderful tool encouraging citizens to get the vaccines or to get the boosters. So Isn't there a contradiction when we, the MPs, voted in favor of this certificate and the situation now? There is a gap between both, isn't there? So despite everything that has been said, why is this certificate being maintained? What's its use? I would just like to add something. I think I understand that for the European Commission, it is clear that today the COVID certificate does not prevent the spread of the disease, but helps planning its use, well, for the 27 member states. So we've heard, and the European Commission shows clearly that the value of this certificate is the planning, the methodology planning added value in the member states. It is not there to prevent the spread of the disease anymore. The vaccinated people have a feeling of security. They have the feeling they can move freely, they can circulate freely without risk of being infected, while it is clear now that vaccines do not prevent the spreading of the disease, and the certificate doesn't prevent it either. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jan Stadler for him to answer to Michèle Rivasi's questions.
Thank you to both for these questions. Maybe starting at the top with the impact assessment. Indeed, when we prepared the original proposal in March 2021, and now with the extension, that there was simply, I mean, you know, the time it takes to prepare an impact assessment. I think by the time this would have completed, the pandemic would have been over. But we have produced two important evaluations. We have produced a report in October 2021, let's say an early term review, as was also a request from the European Parliament. So that was published in October. And then there's a more extensive now implementation report that was published in March 2022. Obviously, both documents are public, and for those that are interested, that they can read them. So indeed, those reflections that are in the report fed into our thinking about that. And then on the subject, I mean, it's true. Obviously, the virus and the protection afforded by the different public health interventions we've had at our disposal, it develops, it changes. We have the emergence of new variants, so obviously that the changes certain equations. Maybe to come back to the more fundamental point, the COVID certificate aims to support free movement by giving the citizens a tool that they can use if and when the member states put in place travel restrictions linked to public health. So it's not the Commission, it's not the European Parliament or the Council that make the decision. It's the member state that is responsible for public health policy that decides require now in times of a pandemic certain requirements: passenger locator forms, a test certificate, alternatively possibly a vaccination certificate. And with the EU digital COVID certificate, as a citizens, I have the right to receive, and I have the possibility to make use of that when traveling. That's all. And this is also why we proposed to extend it now, not because we want member states to continue these restrictions. In fact, no, we have urged now at several occasions, and we have commended those member states that have by now lifted the travel restrictions. I think we have 14 or 15 that don't require the certificates anymore at this stage, which we welcome. But we don't know what will happen if we were to end the framework now. It would no longer be available as a possible tool in case we need it. Hopefully, I think we all agree, we don't need it. That would be the ideal scenario. then that. But we have it. We keep it in our pocket, this tool, in case member states reimpose these requirements, and but we keep it only for a time limited period. I stop here because I think there are maybe other questions that we should tackle as well.
Un'ultima domanda, se è possibile, che viene dalle chat. Cosa ne è delle consultazioni online?
How about the online consultations?
Di fatto. E infine,
the citizens of different countries have expressed their opinion. So what are you going to do with the results of these consultations? And the Commission should be harsher and take harsher measures against those countries that don't respect human rights. I'm thinking of Italy, for example, leaving citizens without a job just because they are not vaccinated. These countries should be issued a warning. They just trample human rights. What do you think of those countries like Italy that don't respect human rights?
Thank you. Yes, thanks for coming back to that, because I think we had a couple of questions in the chat about the feedback. So every legislative proposal adopted by the Commission is published online for a feedback period of, I think, 8 weeks. So this was done with this proposal as we do with normally with all other proposals as well. We have received, it's true, quite a lot of feedback. And now what happens is that the Commission will inform the Parliament, specifically the chair of the responsible committee in the Parliament, of the results, and will inform the Council presidency, so the two bodies that are now negotiating the Commission's proposal, so that they can, when deliberating on the proposal, take this feedback into account. So this is how this procedure is handled, because now, of course, the proposal is not with us, not with the Commission, but with the Parliament and with the Council to decide what they want to do with it. And on coming back on Italy, I think here this is indeed a very important point. Public health policy, of course, that's for the member states to decide. Member states have taken different approaches to how to deal with the pandemic. But this is outside of the scope, for example, of the COVID certificate regulation, as I explained before, which is for legal reasons limited to free movement.
Michèle, the floor is yours.
Merci de ces réponses. On n'est pas
Thank you for those answers. We're not really satisfied with your answers because we still don't understand the use of this pass right now, as from now. So let's move on to the second part. We will have someone from the ECDC making recommendations. The ECDC is a European agency. I wanted to take this opportunity to make a couple of remarks. So I thank you for being here with us on behalf of the Commission, and I thank the representative of ECDC for being with us. But you will understand why people don't understand. Well, of course, the pass was adopted to harmonize the situation between the 27 member states. It was free of charge, it encouraged free movement of people, and so on. Now we have 5 member states, well, several member states, Denmark, Ireland, Slovenia, among others, who don't ask the European certificate. In Belgium, it's not required on the Belgian territory. Mr. Donzelli, Mr. Biondi, Mr. Zizi told you clearly that it is useless. Why do you keep it? You're keeping it because you're saying, well, if tomorrow we have new variants, if tomorrow there is an increase in the infection rate, we will need it.
La réalité à l'heure actuelle, c'est que...
But the current reality is that nobody sees any use in it. So these are my remarks according to what I heard. So in this second panel, there'll be two people, Thomas Hoffmann and Emmanuel Robosin, who represent the ECDC and who will tell you about forecasts concerning the current epidemiological situation. I'm now going to give the floor to the main expert, Mr. Emmanuel Roboussi, responsible for preparedness to emergency situations, emergency preparedness and response. Mr. Roboussin, you have the floor.
On ne vous entend pas.
If you can please unmute yourself.
Okay. Ah, okay.
At the moment, the CDC account is still muted. If you can unmute yourself, we sent you a request. Okay.
This should be better. Can you hear me, please?
We can hear you now perfectly.
Yes, thank you so much. And can you see the slides?
Indeed, we can.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will present together with Thomas Hoffmann some slides on the current situation and also a look forward as far as that is possible in a difficult, let's say, critical situation. So here, first of all, a recap of the current situation. This is from our last report. ECDC has been creating weekly reports on the situation, both globally and with a focus on the EU, EEA countries. So globally, we see that there is still widespread transmission. This is still a pandemic situation with high transmission in the EU, but also some other parts of the world have still high transmission, and we should never lose out of sight the global picture when we talk about the situation, because it fluctuates. At one point it is high in a country, and a month later it is low, and it changes constantly. When we look at the situation in the EU, EEA, we see a patchy situation with no clear north-south or east-west trend. So I think in general, there are differences between countries. There are also differences within countries, but in general, high transmission. So the left upper graph shows the case notifications. These are the cases notified by the EU countries to ECDC. We see that there was in the beginning of the year a very high peak coinciding with the emergence of the Omicron variant, who is more transmissible, and then a large decrease, and now it's a little bit more stable, going up and down. We will see how it will be in the next weeks. When we see on the bottom the blue lines, the dark line is the elderly, and the younger people are the lighter lines. So there is more transmission in younger people, including in those who are not vaccinated. And to the right, we see the hospitalization rates, which are also going down compared with the beginning of the year. As was already mentioned before, counting all the cases is a difficult attempt to get a full picture, and that's heavily influenced by the strategy. So, and we know that now with high transmission, the strategies of testing have been changing. We see a change in the number of people tested in the EU on the top. But we also know that the type of people that are tested are different. So, of course, if the testing strategy changes, the interpretation of these case curves become more and more difficult. However, in general, these case counts have been useful to monitor the situation in general. Many people, well, a large proportion of the people in the EU, EEA are vaccinated. We see that severe disease and mortality has been decreased by that, as the vaccines are extremely effective against severe disease and death. We have in the EU now, in the total population, 72% people that have a complete first primary course, so 2 doses for most of the vaccines, and about half of the population has a booster. That's in the total population. We do see that between the countries, there are still large differences, with countries that have over 80% vaccinated, but other countries still with below 50%. So that's an important thing. And this, of course, in the global picture, this inequality is even larger and allows the virus to continue to transmit and also to change. The general picture, this general vaccination coverage hides more variation between the different age groups. So the lowest curves here are the youngest people with no or very few vaccination, and then in the people over 60, more than 91% vaccinated. When we look at which variant, the current variant is almost all the virus detected is Omicron variant. Most was BA, well, currently most is BA2, and it's some BA1 also. So that's overwhelming Omicron now. What comes next? So we cannot, well, no one can forecast very far in the future the pandemic, but we do know that the evolution or the trajectory will be impacted by the duration after infection and after vaccination. Of course, after 1 vaccine or 2 vaccines or 3 vaccines or 4 vaccines, it's different, the duration. So it's not like effective or not effective. It's more or less effective. So most vaccines like boosters are effective against infection, but not 100%. So it is, it's for sure not a panacea against infection, but it has, and it remains still very effective against severe disease. The global vaccination coverage remains important, therefore, and also as long as the virus circulates, emergence of new variants is possible, and we should expect that the situation will continue to fluctuate, as this is, pandemic situation. The variants that will emerge can have a variety of transmissibility, immune escape, or severity, and we do not know how these will look. And so therefore, although we are not sure, we can expect that there will be times where public health institutes and health systems may be under strain. That's also with a normal flu possible. So in this situation, in the pandemic, that's for sure to be expected that there can be times where the systems become again under strain. As we cannot make specific predictions, I think we work with different scenarios, and at different times there could be one or another scenario more dominant. So these scenarios can go from a very manageable, diminished threat to emergence of a new pandemic or really unmanageable winter. So we do not know, and all scenarios are possible. And therefore, the countries, the public health institutes and the ministries of health should make, prepare for a high to tackle outbreaks or emergence of new variants. It's important to continue the monitoring of the situation and the virus characteristics. And as I referred to, the testing strategies change should take into account let's say, should adapt from full measurement of all cases to sentinel-based surveillance systems that allow for a sample-based better estimation of the situation. So, and this is a transition that the public health institutes and Ministry of Health try to go towards, but that's a difficult move that will take time. But it's important to go to better surveillance and to continue to support the surveillance systems strengthening. And then it remains important, as we have seen, that there are still a large proportion of the population not protected, and we know that it's a good protection against severe disease and mortality. It's still important to increase vaccination coverage. ECDC will continue to monitor, gather information, and share in support of policy. And in this moment, is a good moment to start the exercise of lessons learned. And ECDC is also in contact with the countries to support looking back at the situation, what went fine, what was more difficult, and what can we strengthen to improve in the future. Also, keeping in mind that maybe some systems that were in place during the pandemic need to be reactivated if new variants were to emerge. Also considering, of course, the wider health issues like mental health, long COVID, and the care backlog, so with a broad perspective. I will give now the floor to Thomas Hofmann for some words on the certificate.
Yes, just to conclude, in a way, as you also said, you would like to hear some recommendations, and ECDC always has been heard throughout the process of first developing the DCC and then reviewing it from time to time. So we can, of course, also look at this, at this point in the pandemic, also give our perspective on it. And it's, of course, important to go back to the very beginning. We have heard it before. The DCC was introduced to free movement. Since then, since it was introduced, of course, the situation has changed. Omicron has emerged and is dominating globally. Vaccination provides higher protection against severe disease than against infection and transmission. We have very high levels of transmission with Omicron. We have a high proportion of people who had previous infection. And as we have heard, we have large parts of the EU, EEA population, which is vaccinated, but vaccination coverage still will be a significant factor for future evolution. So in conclusion, looking at the DCC now is that there's, of course, generally time to adjust response measures, and DCC is also one element of the one response measure. So it is time to adjust measures to prevent severe outcomes and to protect immunocompromised and vulnerable population groups. There's also, in line with the EMA and ECDC recommendation, to provide boosters to people above. We all have to take into consideration for whatever measure we continue that the SARS-CoV-2 is here to stay. This is a long-term challenge to public health and healthcare systems, but of course there's also other public health aspects which are important to have in mind, not only those related to SARS-CoV-2. ECDC has stated throughout that the DCC does not prove immunity, but is meant to document a vaccination, a test, or recovery. Since Omicron has emerged, the DCC alone is, of course, less and less suitable to control transmission. But it is, of course, in some way a harm reduction measure. It's, of course, good to have standards similar to the WHO, the IHR yellow pass, which documents vaccination. It's also good to have it documented across the EU in a similar way. And of course, it's time now also to really take lessons learned, to be prepared in a better and more tailored way for anything what comes next. Thank you very much. There's additional information for further
Merci.
in the end of this presentation. Thank you, sorry.
Merci, merci, Monsieur Thomas Hoffmann.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thomas Hoffmann. Now, I would like to tell our panelists that it is very important for you to listen, to hear the position of the European Commission and the position from the ECDC. Now, you may not agree with that message, but I think it is quite important to listen to their positions. And then I would like to ask our panelists from ECDC and from the Commission to listen to previous interventions, because you'll have to answer the critical comments made by health representatives and health institutions and contributions saying that the situation is not that clean and that the vaccinated people can still be infected and ill, and that vaccines are actually letting Omicron go through. Now, we've listened to the positions of the Commission, of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Now we're going to look into legal matters. And Mr. Pierre de Bond, attorney for Notre Droit, developed a study on the compatibility of the amending legislative proposal on the EU digital COVID certificate with union law. So I would like to ask you whether that is compatible with treaties of the EU. So you have the floor, Mr. Pierre de Bond, and I would like to thank you very much for being here. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, absolutely. And can you see my presentation, my screen? Yes, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. So following the request of the association Notre Droit, we developed a comprehensive legal study of the implementation of this regulation. And this is an important aspect because we often talk about fundamental rights and about the fact that it's quite difficult to strike a balance between the use of this certificate and the respect for fundamental rights. And so we decided to carry out this legal analysis to look at the European treaties and the competences of the EU and the legislators, so the Parliament and the Council. This analysis is based on the proposal put forward by the European Commission, a proposal that was communicated well ahead. So we had enough time to look into this proposal, and we have also noted that there was an important change in this proposal compared to the initial regulation. So I'd like to move on now to the second slide and highlight that this presentation is only a summary of our study. I'll try to be straight to the point and to react to the previous interventions, but I would like to highlight the fact that this will be a short summary of our analysis. Now, the first conclusion or the first observation is related to the provisions of the EU treaties that this proposal is based on. So this proposal is based on Article 21 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. This is a very important provision that defines the powers of the European institutions that can adopt provisions to facilitate the free movement of people. Now, I'm not going to come back to what previous speakers have said and what you have said, Mrs. Rivasi, but nowadays I believe we can wonder whether the European Parliament and the European Council can still adopt this proposal, because it is not facilitating the free movement, and it is not preventing the transmission of the virus. It seems to be a tool that exists as such, and that is trying to solve the problem because some member states are maintaining their destructions. Article 21 of the treaty is not there to cover that provision. The purpose is to facilitate free movement. So if a member state has adopted a specific restriction, it doesn't mean that there is a competence at European level to try and put an end to that restriction. Actually, we should act differently, and we should go against the member state and attack the member state to demand for the end to this restriction. So Article 21 cannot be used for such a purpose and to reduce the transmission of the virus. Second element, as it was highlighted today, the proposal is based on a purpose other than the basic regulation that was adopted on the 14th of June. The regulation wanted to guarantee this free movement of people within the EU while limiting the transmission of the virus. That was last year in June, even though some studies seem to demonstrate that vaccines could not limit the transmission of the virus. But this basic regulation was drafted on the basis of this idea that it would facilitate free movement of people without promoting the transmission of the virus. But now we no longer refer to the transmission of the virus. This new proposal has another purpose, another objective, which would be to give a permanent status to the current strategy and to limit the impact of the pandemic on the healthcare systems of member states. And so this is something that you cannot do. You cannot change the purpose of this basic regulation. And at least you cannot do that without an in-depth discussion. Now, this one-year extension is based on wrong motivations. All the elements put forward in the proposal explain that because of the health crisis, European citizens should be able to move around freely, and that's why we have to create this COVID certificate. And it could be useful to maintain it and to use it as a tool, because this is the word that is being used, a tool that you can have in your pocket and that you can use if member states impose restrictions to limit access to various social services, to limit the transmission of the virus. This extension is long, 1 year, and for us it is based on wrong motives. We cannot extend a measure if it does not facilitate the free movement of people, especially if this extension is that long, 1 year, and without real motives that would justify this measure. Fourth conclusion, and this is a very important element, and I would like to thank the organizers for today's conference, because I believe it is the first time that we can have an exchange with the Commission, with the ECDC, about this essential question of the European Digital COVID Certificate. which is a clear violation of fundamental freedom. It had many implications for millions of European citizens who could not have a normal social life, who were not authorized to travel. And is it normal today to refer to this emergency to avoid an in-depth democratic debate? Now, I fully understand that the European Commission did not have time to carry out an impact assessment last year, but this impact assessment is fundamental if we want to use this tool that has an impact on free movement and other rights of the citizens, rights that are being threatened by this proposal. And I would like to come to the second part of this study, because the first part of the study is looking at the existence of the competence of the EU. We look at the justification vis-à-vis the treaties, but the second part is wondering whether the EU can use the existence of restrictions in member states to introduce the European Digital COVID Certificate. Now, for all the elements that I mentioned, this is not the right tool. And I believe the European Commission agrees with that. If I fully understood the point of view of the Commission believes that this tool is not necessary and it is not proportionate, but it's up to the European Commission to turn to the member states so that they put an end to the restrictions. Or maybe they should demonstrate at least that these restrictions are significant. And it's true that we had never seen such restrictions in the past with such an intensity. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Mr. de Band. Yes, I believe that we should have had more time because we have many questions to put to you and to put to the European Commission. Now, I would like to hand over to the last speaker, Mr. Bernard Rentier, biologist and virologist, former rector of the University of Liège from Belgium. He's going to tell us about the evolution of variants and immunity and implications on the EU digital COVID certificate. And that's important because we're being told that tomorrow we could have new variants. This is what the ECDC told us. So what is the situation? You have the floor, Mr. Bernard Rentier. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me. Now, I believe that I'm not in the same position as my scientific colleagues, but I would like to start by saying that I fully agree with what Professor Zizi and Biondi said. No problem. I fully share their views. I fully agree with Mr. Donzelli too. And the conclusion is clear. The Green Pass or the European COVID certificates have no meaning. They are useless. And this is something that cannot be defended from a scientific point of view. Now, you can talk about other reasons. You can try to say that you want to push people towards vaccination, but you cannot use scientific elements to demonstrate the usefulness of this pass, of this certificate, to prevent the transmission of the virus. This is something that was clearly said. Now, as any other virus, this SARS-CoV-2 has a very high mutation frequency, and that's why we have new variants. Now, in virology, you know, I have worked in this field for the last 50 years, so I have some experience. And so in virology, by definition, a dominant variant is more transmissible than its predecessors. That's clear, and that's why it's dominant. And it is also generally less pathogenic, so it does not lead to serious forms of the disease. This is what we said. Now, we were told that that was a mistake, but this is exactly what is happening. So we now have forms of the disease that are less serious. We no longer We're no longer facing COVID-19, we're facing COVID-22, and it's not the same. It's not the same virus. Well, of course, these viruses come from the same family. They are cousins, but it's not the same situation. We are now facing a coronavirus that is similar to colds that we have known for decades. Now, if this virus is less pathogenic, it means that this contributes to the endemization of the virus. So as the representative of the Commission said, we have to live with it. Now, when we said that 2 years ago, it was outrageous, but now it's being recognized and accepted. And this is all the more true that this virus is a zoonose, as this was explained by Dr. Zizi, meaning that it can be transmitted from animals to humans and vice versa, meaning that it can constitute a reservoir of viruses and potential variants. And the problem is that variants will escape immunity response. The natural selection on viruses encourages those immune escapes. That's how new variants can emerge, and these will no longer be recognized by the immune system. Now, of course, we can talk about the efficiency of vaccines. We have made calculations on the efficiency of vaccines with people who were volunteers, but I can tell you about Pfizer, for example. We had 43,000 people, 20,000 who were vaccinated, 20,000 who received the placebo. We only had 162 people in the placebo group who were infected by the virus, and only 8 in the group of vaccinated people. So if you compare those figures, you have a protection that is up to 95%, but the figures were really limited. The numbers were very limited. So I think this is quite important to understand. Now, I know we do not have enough time, so I'm not going to go into all the criticisms that we can develop about vaccines. That's not the purpose of this conference today, but I believe it is clear that the appearance of escape variants decrease the efficiency of the vaccines. And today you cannot compare people in a placebo group and vaccinated people. We are comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated people, but these are not matching categories actually. If you want to compare two groups, the members of the groups need to be identical. And here we're talking about totally different categories of people. So people who do not have the same attitudes, the same behavior. So it's extremely difficult to draw conclusions and to compare these groups of vaccinated people and unvaccinated people. So, and of course, when you talk about unvaccinated people, we include the people who were vaccinated twice and who have vaccinated recently and who have not waited for those 2 weeks, those 14 days after the last dose. So it's extremely complicated to measure. But today, we need to recognize that there is a depletion of vaccine immunity over time and within months. We fully understand that. And this is usually interpreted as a loss of immune memory, but actually this is not what is happening. The most logical interpretation is that successive variants become increasingly distant from the antigenicity of the previous strains, and thus they escape the previously acquired immune defense, whether through natural infection or vaccination. So the natural immunity against several viral epitopes, and the epitopes are small pieces of proteins that are pieces of antigens, and an epitope is actually the place where the antibody will settle. And we realized that natural immunity is fighting against these epitopes, and so you have a more robust and longer-lasting immunization than vaccination, which involves a limited number of epitopes all located on the S protein, the famous spike protein, exclusively. And mutations, you know, for a virus, it's very easy. You can simply mutate the S protein to escape from the immunity from the vaccine, but you will not escape the natural immunity. So you see that there's a difference between the immunity provided by the vaccine and the natural immunity.
Manière que d'ailleurs on dit les vaccins, ou on dit même pire, on dit le vaccin.
People speak about the vaccines, or even worse, the vaccine, while there are so many vaccines and they are so different from one another. So the vaccinated, as you recalled, can therefore become infected with the virus. It has also been clearly demonstrated that they can transmit the virus. Everybody agrees on that. The last sampling of the Belgian Institute of Public Health shows a greater incidence of infections among vaccinated people than among non-vaccinated people. It's what Dr. Donzali has told us in great details. I'm not going to dwell on this, but it is an extremely important element. In these conditions, in terms of encouraging people to get vaccinated, well, it's the only goal that can remain to vindicate such a vaccination certificate. Well, it's the only goal it can have is to encourage people to get vaccinated. If vaccinated people infect other people, and if they get infected, the COVID certificate loses any interest unless it is granted to people who have been tested very recently. And even worse, the COVID certificate misses its goal, misses the target, and can give way to very risky behaviors. So, if we consider that such a certificate has to be established and extended, and it's not my opinion at all, it should only be granted after a test, regular test on whether vaccinated or not, and even if you have been infected, if people have been infected, so it should be a negative test certificate. That's what it should be. But you can be positive one day and a negative one day and positive on the next. So we're stuck in this hole. You will have to wind up. I'm sorry. Yes, I'll wind up. A vaccine certificate is not at all a guarantee that the bearer of the certificate is not contagious. So the goal is not reached. A COVID certificate does not guarantee anything. The only thing is a test, an antigenic, preferably an antigenic test, can give a very small security guarantee, but it's still not perfect. So there is no reliable formula of certificate that allows us to meet the declared goals of health security. When the dominant variant is no longer dangerous and even less dangerous than other normal and current viruses, we should really wonder about the need to maintain such an imperfect system. And for those who are still afraid of the danger of the variants, they should know that the certificate in itself is dangerous. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rentier. We don't have time for questions and answers. I hope that given the panel, well, this range of intervention has been quite broad. I will give the floor to Rosa D'Amato. Rosa, would you like to say a word as a conclusion?
Propongo di restare tutti in contatto gli scienziati di
I thank you, and I suggest we should keep in touch.
Per esempio, sono qui alcuni degli esempi.
Of course, we must listen to each other. Scientists must communicate between Italy, France, Belgium. Scientists must keep exchanging opinions. It's very important to be able to exchange opinions. we cannot be the only ones, Michèle and I, to defend human rights in the European Parliament. I really wanted to thank you because you have given us elements that clearly put into question the relevance of this certificate. I would like to ask the Commission to invite more different experts. Experts, well, different from those they usually get together with. But the Commission seems to want to extend the validity of the certificate, but the consultations seem to show that all European citizens are against the renewal of the validity of this certificate. But European MPs have to be convinced, because in a few weeks' time, we are going to vote, and MEPs should be informed, because they are they believe in what ECDC says. They believe that vaccination is the universal solution to this pandemic, and that people are afraid to die, and people are afraid of what they hear in the media, and it's very difficult to have people recognize the validity of unbiased element produced by scientific studies. And the last element I wanted to mention was that there will be a special committee about COVID management, the pandemic management, and we will ask you experts you will be asked to make speeches there, to make interventions there. Well, in the special committee, somebody said that side effects are not even mentioned. Well, this special committee is going to mention side effects. The different strategies will be spoken about, the strategies that were different, that varied very much from member state to member state. The treaty of the WHO about international pandemics will be talked about. The treaty is also a threat, because it is going to favor unique and monolithic management, and the conflicts of interest will be exposed, and also conflicts of interest between different agencies, between different experts, and so on. So Rosa and I and others will fight against the extension of the certificate. And I'm talking to the ECDC and to the Commission representative. You have not given us one single element allowing us to believe that it is necessary to extend this certificate. The only argument I heard is that it is a tool that exists, and you don't want to put an end to it because you look at the future, and just in case there were variants. But we heard Mr. Rancière, who confirmed that it is a vague hypothesis. And if there are variants, if there is another pandemic, the tool can still be taken out of the drawers. But for the time being, it has no value. It only exercises discrimination against people and prevents them from exercising their right to free movement. Well, thank you very much to you all. Thank you very much to all speakers. Thank you very much to Mon Bon Droit, the association, and we are going to keep fighting to make sure the Parliament doesn't vote in favor of the extension of this European COVID certificate, but it is a battle that we haven't won yet. Thank you.